Hello, my loves. My name is Eleanor Schnarr, and this video is going to be about Emanuel Swedenborg's essay on ecstasy from 1741. This video is part of an ongoing series which I am putting together on Swedenborg's internal breathing practices. If you are interested in pursuing the topic further, I have a paper published in our Daily Bread newsletter, which contains an extensive bibliography. For a more general introduction to Swedenborg and internal breathing, I recommend that you follow the links on the description in some of my older videos. The text, which we will be discussing today, is very special and very obscure. We will be going through it line by line to help us understand how Swedenborg understood the physiology and the psychology of the ecstatic state. This essay comes from a portion of his work on the brain, which was not published in either of the books which you can get from the Swedenborg Scientific Association, and in fact has not been published in English since the 1830s. In the early 1740s, Emanuel Swedenborg was deeply immersed in his study of the brain and his search for an anatomical correlate to consciousness and the soul. When he turned his attention to what he called the morbi cerebri, or the diseases, dysfunctions, and abnormalities of the brain, he wrote extensively about various ailments which he believed had some origin in the dysfunction of the central nervous system. Everything from epilepsy to paralysis to migraines to hypnagogia or sleep paralysis and memory loss. Each section describes the ailment, makes some attempt to explain it with swellings, hardenings, or lesions within the brain, and importantly, associates it with a particular kind of breathing. One of the most interesting parts of this work is a brief essay titled De Ecstasy seu Energumene, or On Ecstasy and Religious Trance. So today, we are going to be talking about ecstasy and trance states. Many different spiritual and cultural traditions have given us different names for this kind of experience. We might call it psychedelic euphoria, samadhi, the beatific vision, kundalini awakening, or the DMT flash. What is common to them all is a state of mind in which there is a sudden, almost violent enlightenment, as on the edge of death or in the throes of orgasm. It is an abrupt shattering of the normal constraints of reality. Here is the full text of the essay from beginning to end. It can be found in numbers 830 to 833 of Codex number 55. We are going to look at numbers 830 through 32 specifically. Number 833 is a list of ailments that can cause ecstasy, and if anyone is interested, it will be included in the video description along with the full text. Let's break it down and read through the whole text together one section at a time. Ecstasy is that state of life in which it seems that the rational mind, or soul, is separated and seems to emigrate out of the body while they actually remain and life continues, the interface or connection between the two being simply disrupted. It is like an intermediate state between sleep and death. Before the agony of death, some people fall into ecstatic states, and thereafter they believe in the soul itself. Swedenborg starts us out with a very direct definition. The type of ecstasy which he is describing is the ecstasy of what we might call a near-death or out-of-body experience, when the mind or soul seems to be separated from the body, although they both still live. Contemporary researchers might categorize near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences as separate phenomena, but, as we shall see, Swedenborg thought that they had the same causal mechanism. It is important to note the element of gnosis in Swedenborg's description, a profound conviction of the reality of the soul, is a primary feature of this experience. Perhaps this has something to do with the idea, which he later articulates, that the first scriptures were written on the hearts of the most ancient people. It seems that the first prophets, in days of old, may have been those who discovered the means to enter into these trance states and bring back knowledge of the most intimate sphere of heaven. He goes on. Others also call the near-death state in people who have survived drowning ecstasy, namely those who have survived prolonged submersion, or of those dragged from the water who lie stretched out on tables, pale as death, but after violently vomiting up the water, and when their bodies have warmed up, they return to their former pristine vitality. The case is the same with those who have been suffocated by chest pain or heart attack, or by the rope, and sometimes, after being brought to bed, have revived. He is explicitly and very intentionally talking about a near-death experience. That means that NDEs were something that he was very familiar with. But, as we shall soon see, ecstatic states can extend far beyond life-threatening situations. Certain animals, and insect species, says Swedenborg, are supposed to lead an ecstatic life through the whole winter. In this way, the swallows are said to spend the winter underwater, the bears hidden away in their dens, and others in their little clefts or holes. Like the worms and insects, they lived without food and respiration, and with the approaching spring, they resuscitate themselves into life. This is one of those fun little 18th century science moments. Apparently, it was pretty common at the time to think that when birds disappeared during the winter months, that they had actually gone underneath sea ice instead of flying south. Migration theory hadn't been formed yet. But the rest of what he's saying is largely true. Now, of course, we can't ask a bear or a bat about any subjective experience of an ecstatic trance, but we can observe how their whole metabolism slows down. Their body temperature drops, and their breathing and heart rate slow down dramatically. So even though Swedenborg associates the ecstatic state with near-death phenomena, it goes well beyond that. The life of embryos in the womb and of chicks in the eggs with the lungs still closed are also called states of ecstasy. I want you to pay attention to this line in particular. This fact is profoundly important to what is going to come later in Swedenborg's life story. The fact that he believed that this state of transcendental awareness was something which all human beings experienced as the inaugural state of their lives. An idea which later morphs into his concept of the most ancient church. To Swedenborg, churches were psychological states which existed both in the macrocosmic historical narrative of life on Earth and also in the microcosm of an individual's life story. This ecstatic state of the womb reflects in the ecstatic consciousness of the first humans. Jellyfish, chrysalids, which just means any insect who builds a chrysalis, and nymphs before their metamorphosis or their change into butterflies undergo ecstasy. Isn't it wonderful how he throws this bit in there? This section strongly illustrates how the ecstatic state is one of change and development. A caterpillar inside a chrysalis has to completely dismantle its body and turn into an amorphous soup in order to emerge as a butterfly. So like butterflies, the ecstatic trance state is a place from which we can break down our sense of possessive ego and evolve and regenerate our idea of what it is to exist. Humanity is different, he continues. True ecstasy becomes absolute upon death, before the transformation into bodies which are pure and celestial. Under normal circumstances, humans do not experience ecstatic states. In fact, you can go your whole life, goddess forbid, without ever experiencing this direct interior influx, except for the moments of birth and death. In fact, I think that's what Swedenborg would identify as one of the main pathologies of Western civilization. We have a tendency to be external, materialistic, and colonialist. From that perspective, Swedenborg has to initially come to this topic as an anatomist before he can experience it himself. But as we will see, examples abound of people who have found ways to access that level of consciousness. He goes on. Those who live for many years and months without food, of whom there are many examples, fall easily into ecstasy. Of course, fasting and ascetic diets have always been part of the religious experience. In the same way, by the holiness of a life, it becomes clarified and inspired when the self is seized beyond itself or elevated above the world. At this point, he finally gets to religious ecstasy after all of these biological considerations, placing it on par with all these other circumstances which can bring about the ecstatic state. It is important to point out what is a consistent theme for Swedenborg: the idea that the ecstatic state is actually the default. It is what we grow out of, and that to which we will return. Our possessive ego, or proprium, as he calls it, rides on the externalization of breath and therefore life itself. Breath becomes a medium for speech instead of a moderator of spiritual influx, and we forget our true nature. But from a meditative state, we may learn to become aware of the nature of the soul. He goes on, those for whom the mind's operations are emptied come into a lighter form of ecstasy. They gradually remove themselves from the body, withdrawing their soul from sensory objects, and meanwhile breathe tacitly with their lungs filled and elevated. So this is where he starts really talking about meditation as such. This is a loose description of the type of breath control exercises which Swedenborg would experiment with throughout the rest of his life. One of the interesting things about this essay is how it shows that the origin of his internal breathing practices was in many ways a physiological one. The trance states, which he would enter into in order to explore the spiritual world, come from a very sophisticated and scientific kind of breath control. By reducing the more exterior breath, by breathing tacitly with the lungs filled and elevated, he is able to put himself into a state where he can be carried away by the ecstatic trance. To a certain extent, Swedenborg seems driven by his own curiosity, but at the same time, he is constantly emphasizing his own passivity. This is something which is done at the mercy of divine influx. Such techniques were common knowledge to ancient yogis and mystics. For an example of this ancient wisdom, Swedenborg quotes Aristotle, quoting Plato, saying, "When the soul is loosened from the body, it ascends and is enlightened, and descends into obscurity. But after it is purged, it ascends again." Plato said, "I often contemplate the soul. I seem to be released from my body. I enjoyed the highest good with an incredible pleasure. I was particularly struck with astonishment when I recognized that I was a certain part of a higher world, and I grasped the immortality of life under the highest light, which could neither be expressed by words or perceived with the ears, nor comprehended with the thoughts. At last, wearied of my contemplation, my intellect receded into fantasy, and then, when that light failed me, I became sad. Again leaving the body and having returned into the previous state, I perceived my soul bathed in light, which at one time flowed into the body, and at another was excited above it." In response to this quotation, Swedenborg makes the distinction between genuine and spurious states of ecstasy. Even Plato's experience of sudden spiritual awakening, he says, is not a genuine one if there is not an elevation above fantasy itself. Again, we have this emphasis on apophatic formlessness. As much as Swedenborg is a Neoplatonist, he frequently referring to formalist explanations for things. Here he is clearly emphasizing the experience of going beyond the world of mental abstractions. Direct divine influx and our ability to become aware of it lies in the realm beyond forms. Likewise, he continues, exorcists and enchanters understand the art of inducing trance ecstasy in the midst of drums, as it was once done in Lapland. This reference to the exorcists and enchanters of Lapland shows the influence of Carl Linnaeus, who was a friend of Swedenborg's. The famous botanist had recently returned from an expedition to the far north, where he studied the cultures and the plant life above the Arctic Circle. There is a story that Linnaeus brought back a shamanic reindeer cloak, which he gave as a gift to his friend Emanuel, who was known to wear it around Stockholm in the wintertime. So the influence from what Swedenborg might call the ancient church comes from the north and the south. There are other rituals, or magical potions, which close off the breath of the lungs. Practitioners are thrown into a state where they sense only an intimate influx. This seems to be referring to some kind of shamanic or psychedelic experience, which is induced by substance and ritual, drums, mushrooms. He does not outright condemn these practices as overtly harmful, but he does provide a caveat. But with them, fantastical imagination might endure. The mind is not elevated above itself, but remains below itself in the first threshold of the body. The subjunctive might endure is very important in this passage. We have all of these rituals and potions and drums, and all of that can indeed lead us to the door of ecstasy, but none of that stuff will help you cross over. Only the intimate awareness of the influx of divine love can do that. The body, and more so nature, can be an amazing teacher, but nature is bound up in the world of forms. True transcendence, real, deep, sacred ecstasy, has to negate all of that. As soon as you've found the thing, as soon as you have affixed a name to God, the mind gets dragged back down. All the asanas and the psychedelics and the rituals, all the manic repetition of prayers and the societies and the students and the practices mean nothing if you cannot get yourself beyond them. That is why humans normally only feel true ecstasy in the womb and at the transition into death. In those states, we have no choice but to go beyond the possessive ego proprium to encounter the true nature of the soul and the divine light of consciousness. This seems like a good place to bring up the theory that all of this is moderated by an endogenous production of dimethyltryptamine, the most powerful psychedelic compound in the planet, which is widely present in an inactive form in most plant life. While I would caution against assigning too much value to a single chemical, from experimental data we can see that when the normal rhythm of the heart is interrupted, that the brain responds by producing massive amounts of this stuff. It doesn't seem too far-fetched in light of this to say that changing the way that you breathe so that you mimic a near-death state could trigger such a release. None of that chemistry would matter to our experience except that when Amazonian cultures and contemporary chemists have figured out ways to refine and activate this compound. When DMT is consumed, it triggers the most intense and life-changing visions. To quote Terence McKenna, it's like a 747 crashing into your house. There is a quality of absolute certainty in the reality of this experience. These feelings of certainty, they are not moderated by an overwhelming devotion to the formlessness of true bliss, can easily lead to the feeling that we have gained some special insight into the nature of natural reality. In the vortex of the psychedelic flash, we are given visions of the self, and we find that the interior world is far more complex and inhabited than we would have possibly imagined. But if we mistake the internal, subtle spiritual realms for another level of physical reality, we end up in a state of mind which only serves to glorify the ego and leads to feelings of paranoia and ultimately madness. Sacred ecstasy works through nature. At no point is the manifold complexity of this living matrix interrupted for the inflow of divine presence. But genuine ecstasy goes far beyond the world of molecules. The chemical compound should not be mistaken with the experience itself. In number 831, Swedenborg abandons the sociological context of the ecstatic state and goes straight for an anatomical explanation, which references his work on the soul, saying, "Knowledge of the interplay between the soul and the body is required to contemplate the most intimate causes of ecstasy. What is the soul? What is the rational mind? What is the intimate or internal sense? What is imagination? What are our higher faculties, all the way to the external senses, down to the determinations of embodied action? What is distinct and proper to each operation, and what is their general operation like when they act in cooperative community? Besides innumerable other things which we shall endeavor to explain in our rational psychology in its introduction." Here we have Swedenborg explaining how the ideas put forward in this essay and the question of the near-death ecstatic state in general become the seed for the spiritual explorations which he would carry forward into the rest of his life. Rational Psychology, the work on the physiology of the soul, is a book which is worth exploring. "I shall state only this in advance," he says, "that our rational mind, whose faculties are intellect and will, is not the soul, but its first operation, mediated by the simplest organs." From elsewhere in Swedenborg's work on the brain, we can assume that by the simplest organs, he means individual cells in the cerebral cortex. He is defining the mind as we experience it as the thing which the brain does. He identifies cognition, reason, will, and motion with the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, placing reason and verbal cognition on the left side and will and emotion on the right. The soul itself exists beyond all of this. It is the substance which runs through the sieve of the brain, that thing which is organized and mediated by our interior cognitive lives. In some ways, it is the progression of time itself. But what is the essential animating force, of which the purest essence of the body participates and through which it becomes spiritual? A person derives their own spirituality from their soul and takes their natural existence from the body and the world, which is the reason that the mind is not just delirious, but suffers an ecstasy or trance, nay, that it can succumb to death, while the soul survives, which sits above the intellect and above comprehension. What is being implied is the idea that while the soul, anima, the primary causal agent of the embodied self, can exist in perpetuity, the mind itself has to die. When Swedenborg talks about regeneration or spiritual rebirth, he emphasizes its relationship with the proprium, that is, possessive ego. Proprio is a Latin word that means I own, I possess. It's mine, it's all mine. Isn't it interesting how we assume that we own our thoughts? This cognitive matrix which has formed around us, made out of brain cells and breath. We own our own thoughts as much as we own the stars in heaven. We think the mind can be possessed. We think that memories, cognitions, and desires are our own, when in reality, they are all a part of the same decaying cosmos as the sun and the moon. The regenerative process is one through which we learn to put aside this possessive ego, And once we have learned to do that, we are given a new sense of self, a heavenly identity of pure love. Love and possession are mutually exclusive forces. The whole journey of becoming is to move from a position in which the self says, I own, into a position where the self says, I love. The goal is to become love, to identify with only love, not as some limited form of an emotional state, but the cosmic love, which acts as the unified, non-dual field beyond all creation. All these ecstatic states, these practices and magical powers, mean nothing if the goal is not unity with love. The acknowledgement that beyond all our pointless bickering, there is something which continually and in every atom of creation is pushing reality into being towards some transcendental goal. Swedenborg continues. The mind exists by means of the purest and the simplest organs. Its bilateral bondage must be loosened. This bilateral bondage is the bondage of the left and right hemispheres, or in more abstract terms, it is the bondage of the spiritual duality of love and wisdom, a concept which will be familiar to you if you've spent any time with Swedenborgian theology. The illusion of natural reality is that good and truth are separate. This is illustrated in the body. The respiration of the lungs and the beating of the heart seem separate, just as the psychological faculties of love and wisdom seem to separate themselves in our minds. But when you move into the brain, you see that these two vital waveforms are actually harmonized and unified in the organ of consciousness. Love is the highest form of truth. Like the heart and the lungs, they cannot in reality be separated. So the ecstatic state is one of non-dual realization, just as it is mediated by the breath of the heart. Swedenborg continues. The degrees and varieties of ecstasy and its various manifestations effectively loose bondage. Judgments are made from this and from the other internal faculties. Truly, that is enough on this for now. Swedenborg seemed just to cut himself off. I'm strongly reminded of a story about Ramakrishna, who lived about a century after this text was written in India. The sage gathered all of his best students together, saying that this was to be the day that he taught them about how the sacred light of consciousness operates at the highest chakra. He describes the procession of the life energy up from the heart center and into the brain, but despite his best efforts, he cannot bring himself to articulate the nature of the soul at the highest point in the embodied system. Swedenborg seems to run into the same problem. The nature of the soul, in its pure, unmanifested state, is an inarticulate one. It cannot be directly described. Putting any sort of verbal signifier on it makes it vanish instantaneously. It can only be alluded to by means of correspondence and metaphor. It is not surprising that soon after he completed this work, he would begin his work on the word explained, which represents a hermeneutical shift from a scientific one to an exegetical one. Sacred scripture becomes a metaphor for the soul. Moreover, he is saying that spiritual practices are the means by which we can organize the mind in a way which lets us escape from it. In that transcendental sphere of non-possession, the sphere of embryos and the dead, we can intimately know God for ourselves in the embodied reality of this very moment. In number 832, Swedenborg theorizes about the physical correlate to the ecstatic experience. I suspect, he says, that an alternate cause of ecstasy is the inhibition or suffocation of the respiration of the lungs, while the pulsation of the heart and the arteries and the movement of the cerebrum and cerebellum, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord survives. So he's associating the ecstatic trance state with a shift in embodied awareness from the external breath of the lungs to an internal breath moderated by the nervous system and the heart. The journey to ecstasy, therefore, is the shift between the lung-centered breath of spoken language and the heart and brain-centered breath of spirit. He goes on. This movement perfectly coincides with the alternating motion of the heart, from which a change arises in the state of the whole system. Everything corporeal shrinks and wavers, nor does it dare to rise up against the soul, which then acts and governs absolutely. This near-death spiral into ecstasy is portrayed as almost mechanical. Again, ecstatic consciousness becomes the default. It's like the realization that there are no clouds in space, that there is no night in space, that the sun cannot see a shadow, or that God is love. It is the realization that the verbal matrix of meaning, which we have constructed for ourselves, actually has very shaky ontological footing. That our normal sensory range is a mere fraction of all the possible manifestations of the cosmic pleroma, and that behind this whole vast illusory continuum, guiding us by the hand like a patient mother, is the inescapable force of time. If all you are looking at is the brutal progression of deterministic events, you will find yourself in an endless entropic fractal. Swedenborg says, nature is an abyss, and there is nothing left but awe. There must be an attractor in all this vast chaos, a vector along which the waveform collapses. That vector is the mind, the harmonic pathways of the cerebrum, which support our consciousness and determine our internal landscape. And to the angelic mind, that vector curves towards love. Swedenborg continues, blood, then, does not excite the muscle. The blood vessels, the auricles or ventricles of the heart. It only excites the nerve fibers from the head, the spirit of which acts at alternate times with the blood. As the body is no longer left to its own jurisdiction, it falls into an ecstatic swoon. The soul, liberated from the bridles and prisons of flesh, exists for itself and its own intuition, in its own spirit. All alone, the body seems far away, and it becomes vegetative, or it adopts a fetal or embryonic vitality. If you've watched any of my older videos, you will know how you can measure the entrainment of limbic oscillations to nasal respiration. When you breathe through your nose, the whole interior part of your brain oscillates. We can use an fMRI technology to watch how breathing through the nose entrains the oscillations of the limbic system and affects our cognition and our consciousness. Swedenborg notes in his treatise on the pituitary gland that these deep recesses of the sinus cavity respond to the motion of breath. So you could say that in a way we breathe through our brains when we breathe through our nostrils. He's basically saying that if you stop the breath from the lungs, the internal breath from the nervous system will take over. Consciousness follows with it, turning inward and becoming aware of the animating force which is mediated by the nervous system. He goes on to offer a very interesting hypothesis. Immutability of the state exists only with those in whom the foramen ovale is open, or in whom it has been unlocked. When the lungs collapse, and therefore the passage into the pulmonary artery is denied, without passage for the blood through the foramen ovale or the coronary vessels, the precordia are necessarily burst, and the ecstatic person dies. So Swedenborg is providing a caveat. Not everyone is capable of surviving this kind of ecstasy. The foramen ovale is a passage in the heart between the left and right ventricle, which in the womb allows for blood to pass back into circulation without going through the lungs. In about 25% of the population, this passage remains open with no ill effects. Swedenborg believed that ecstatic near-death states could only be survived by those with this particular abnormality, or those who had learned to open it up. It served as a kind of pressure release valve, which allowed blood to flow backward and therefore not damage the heart. This whole hypothesis clearly comes from the mind of a mechanist. He approaches the question of ecstatic bliss as a hydraulics problem. To Swedenborg, the body is created in such a way that it mediates the flow of energy according to the different degrees of reality. Swedenborg treats the body as a vast system of interconnected tubes which work together to support consciousness. Put a kink in one, and the whole system is affected. While the foramen ovale hypothesis is certainly interesting, I don't want people running off to get a CT scan of your heart. I think that would be missing the point entirely and falling back into the world of forms. The foramen ovale is a fetal shunt, which means that in the womb it is open in everyone, and Swedenborg clearly believed that people had the ability to reopen it at some point later in life. This passage facilitates a purely internal breath cycle. The point is not whether or not it is open at this moment, but rather that we all have the capacity to remember that state of deep innocence before our first breath toward the world into opposing hemispheres. It seems as if this essay planted a seed in Swedenborg's mind. This is one of the earliest articulations of the idea of internal breathing, and soon afterward, Swedenborg himself would start experimenting with his own meditation practice, flirting with the edges of death and bringing back detailed accounts of what lay beyond in the galaxy of inner space. He famously had a profound and tectonic spiritual awakening 5 years after this passage was written, a record of which he would publish in his vast theological works. The longer he looked inward, the more he saw, and aided by the gentle oscillations of his own subtle anatomy, his spiritual eyes began to open.